desde a criação do Instituto de Estudos Ferroviários e História dos Transportes, foi o diretor até 2014, tem trabalhado como consultor histórico como o Ministério Britânico dos Transportes e com outros ministérios, e pode ser consultor histórico. E, de fato, Divall, Colin, continua hoje as suas pesquisas sobre a história da mobilidade, em particular dos transportes públicos no sul da Inglaterra, e, ao mesmo tempo, está envolvido em campanhas pela mobilidade ativa e sustentável da sua pequena cidade, como ele disse. Colin, como já referiu a Luísa, é consultor deste projeto, do projeto que apresentou a Luísa. Com a Luísa já trabalhou em outros projetos sobre mobilidade urbana sustentável e também em instituições ou associações como a Associação Internacional de História dos Transportes, do Tráfego e da Mobilidade. Bem, esperamos que toda a sua experiência beneficie este projeto e as coisas que vão, o debate que vai haver hoje cá, e especialmente através da metodologia que vai explicar cá, metodologia sobre laboratórios de história, e nesse sentido a sua talk, a sua apresentação hoje se titula Contando Histórias, porque o passado tem importância para o futuro da mobilidade urbana. Then, Colin, the floor is yours, or the bike lane is yours. Please write as you want, and happy to hear you for 30 minutes, 35. Thank you so much, Colin.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen from the United Kingdom, where it is overcast. At least it's not raining. I understand the weather is much better where you are, so in many ways I prefer to be with you, but it was not to be. You will recognize this picture, I'm sure, but it is quite appropriate because much of what I want to talk about this afternoon is really a case study, an example of the kind of history usable past in order to engage with wider publics and get people to think more carefully and more imaginatively about the future of travel in our towns and cities. Indeed, the fact that you are all sitting in the same room at this workshop means that you are interested and perhaps very actively involved in trying to bring about what I imagine is quite radical change to the way that people move around Lisbon, but in other words, introducing new infrastructure and cycle lanes and so on. And if, like me, you've been involved in that kind of activity, in my case for several decades, I'm sure you will often have been frustrated about the fact that ideas which to you seem very sensible and very practical are dismissed out of hand because people say, well, that's just completely unreasonable. You know, it's impossible to imagine that we can have cycle tracks everywhere or better public transport and so on and so forth. And I think this is quite a common phenomenon, this opposition from people, from citizens, from politicians, from policymakers to radical ideas, this sort of dismissal out of hand that things are impossible. And as I say, it's a phenomenon that many political activists have observed. And in the last few years, many such activists have come to the conclusion that we have to get a lot cleverer, a lot more imaginative about how we communicate and engage with skeptics, indeed the vast majority of the population, in order to get people to think more imaginatively about the future, whether it's transport or climate change or whatever. Now, I've been particularly inspired by George Monbiot, a British activist whom you may have heard of, who in his most recent book has argued, along with many other people, that we have to get, as activists, we have to get a lot cleverer about creating stories, popular stories that we can use to fire people's imagination and to get them to think more broadly, more imaginatively, more widely about the future of transport or whatever it is. And so Monbiot this quote comes from Monbiot's book. He is advocating that that activists have to get a lot cleverer at developing stories, telling stories that learn from the past, place us in the present, and guide the future. So this talk is really about giving you an outline about how other colleagues and I have attempted to do this in particularly the UK context, but more widely across Europe, as I think Louisa was indicating in her introductory remarks. And in this talk, I really want to focus not on the popular storytelling itself, that's the stage which comes later in the process, but in developing an understanding of the past, a history, a usable past as I call it, which will help us to develop the kind of stories that we can then use to try to excite the imagination of people who are skeptical about ideas which to us seem very sensible. So this way of doing history, this way of developing history, the usable past as I call it, is very much a way of understanding the past that looks to the future. That's the most important point. We are interested in understanding the past insofar as it will help us to think better and more imaginatively about the future. And I think in particular, this future-orientated way of doing history has to focus on how we can better develop visions, imagine better and more widely about the future of transport in our cities. Yes, if it feeds into the detailed work of policy making, so much the better, but I want to emphasize it's really about shifting the way that people think about the future, getting them to think more imaginatively, come up with better visions of how we might move around our cities. And it does that, at least in part, by helping people to understand how we have got to the present, our present position, how we find ourselves in cities which all too often are dominated by automobiles, and that in itself, helping people to understand how we come to present position, is one way in which looking back to the past can contribute to this popular storytelling about the future, which I've been emphasizing should be the emphasis of this way of doing history. Now, there are many ways of looking at the past and many ways of looking at the past with this view of looking to the future in mind. But in this particular talk, I want to emphasize a number of strands, a number of focuses. And first and foremost, well, not foremost, but first, I think it's really useful if we look to the past so that we can give people a really good sense of how the way that we have come to travel around our cities today, it's not inevitable. There were many decisions, many debates in the past, many decisions made which led to the position where we are today. In other words, things could have been different. On the other hand, it's also useful to understand the past as a process, a set of decisions, a set of policies, which do tend to lock us into particular ways of moving around our cities, and indeed can even tend to lock us into ways of thinking about how we move around our cities. If we've lived as we have for the last 50 or 60 years with our streets dominated by cars and other autos, it's all too easy to forget that there were alternatives in the past and that there could be alternatives in the future. So, you know, to come back to a point I've already made, I think that although we can't go back to the past in order to read off a nice set of policies, which we can then use to create a set of policies for the present and the future, we can go back to the past and look at it as a reservoir, a collection of alternative visions about how we might move around. And again, they cannot be just slotted into the present day situation, but at least they might inspire people to think more imaginatively about how we move around our cities in the future. So with those few preliminary remarks, I really want to move to the meat of what I have to say today, which is to give you a sense of a study, a case study, which I've developed over the last few years in developing a usable past in relation to transport mobility in one particular part of the United Kingdom. I'll give you a better sense in a few moments about where that is. So in the case study, the big points that I want to bring out is that my intention in developing this study, this piece of history, this usable past, was fundamentally to try to provide the material which could then be used for storytelling, popular storytelling, that would encourage people today, citizens and local politicians and policymakers, to rethink or reframe how we think about traveling around a particular urban area or conurbation that I'm going to talk about. And again, to reiterate what I've already said, I think the main mechanism by which I hope this will happen is by developing or allowing us to develop stories that will free us to imagine about possibilities that common sense, as it were, today's common sense suggests are simply impossible. Now, in this study, I'm going to focus on what I call the policy complex, which is just a fancy word for emphasizing that decision-making is not simply a matter of politicians or policymakers coming up with a set of ideas, making a decision and implementing them. There's a much, much wider range of groups of activists and organizations, including citizens, pressure groups, and so on, as well as local authorities, municipalities, national politicians, and so on. And I also want to emphasize, or I hope the case study will make it clear, that whenever we're looking at the usable past in these terms, I think it's really important that we keep an eye on how popular culture, popular attitudes towards the sorts of policies and ideas that were floating around in the past, we keep a good sense, a good idea of how they were changing and evolving, sometimes in reaction to policy, sometimes in reaction to wider issues as well. So let me turn to the details of the case study, which I'm only going to give you the headlines here. I promise you, the case study is much more detailed. I think Louisa has already circulated the URL for the detailed study, so you can download it if you want after my talk or at some point. And it's a study of a conurbation, I think it's fair to say, over about 20 years, from 1955 to 1975, a conurbation in southeast Dorset, which lies on the south coast of the United Kingdom, a little bit to the west, around about here. The plan that you can see at the bottom gives you a sense of the area that I'm talking about. It is defined by a sort of Victorian stretch of urban area, continuously built up along here, the towns of City, Christchurch and Bournemouth, which these days run into one. And then a travel to work area, which is shown shaded, spreading out about 25 kilometers from that continuously built up coastal strip. And these days, in the early 21st century, the population of that area is around about 400,000 people. It's not actually administered as a city, but in all but terms of its governance, I think it is fair to describe it as a city, or certainly a conurbation of that kind of size. And it is the area, the designated area is run at the moment by 2 local authorities, and they have cooperated over the years to develop quite a well thought out local transport plan, which I've studied in great detail. And all I want to emphasize at this point is that the plan makes a lot of promises, or a lot of commitments to developing sustainable travel, or what's called sustainable travel, particularly in the area of the southeast Dorset conurbation. And it goes some way to pinning down those commitments in terms of measurable outcomes, one of which is reducing the overall level of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, which is all great. This is all good stuff. But unfortunately, until recently, and arguably still today, really rather little progress has been made to achieving these laudable aims. And I want to suggest part of the problem why so little progress has been made is that there's really very little buy-in from the public for the sort of radical measures that are necessary in order to put travel or mobility within the southeast Dorset conurbation on what you and I would understand as truly sustainable basis. So let's go back to the past and see whether we can develop an understanding of the past, a usable past that might help us to develop stories that can convince people that there are practical possibilities for making things better in the future. And the story that I'm going to tell you, so it's really only the headline, is a story partly of the contest back in the 1960s between national politicians and their understanding of urban travel and what local politicians and local advocacy groups, pressure groups, thought might be the best way of organizing travel in the area. It's a story which on the surface is really about an apparently inevitable trend towards more highways and more automobility, but there were quite strong arguments at the time in favor of using railways as to help move people around the area. It's a story, unfortunately, of the loss of long-term flexibility as more and more money was eventually poured into building highways and more people started moving around the conurbation using their cars and other forms of automobiles. So there has been physical lock-in because that infrastructure is there and is used. But again, I do want to stress that the story is one in which we can recover the alternative, arguably more radical visions which citizens had at the time, and which today, I think, can inspire us to think about ways of moving around Southeast Dorset in a more sustainable way. So let's look, first of all, at the national context of this debate back in the early 1960s. And I want to focus particularly on the politics of this word modernization, because it was a word that was used an awful lot at the time. And at the national level, it was used both in relationship to this report, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the future, the Beeching report, which was published in 1963. Dr. Beeching on the left there wrote it, and the Minister of Transport at the time, Ernest Marples, on the right, was his political sponsor. And this report, Traffic in Towns, which was written by Colin Buchanan, who was an urban planner. Both quite radical reports in their day, largely forgotten by everybody except specialist historians. Traffic in Towns, I think particularly, still has international resonance, and if you don't know it, you might be inspired to go and have a look at it after this talk. So let's look about how the word politics was used in these different reports. Sorry, not politics, modernization. Well, Traffic in Towns was written, was sponsored by the Ministry of Transport because it was widely perceived to be a big threat to the vitality of urban life and civilized living in urban towns as a result of the seemingly unstoppable rise of automobiles in the 1950s and early 1960s. And the report gave out the promise of both being able to renew towns and cities in the UK as modern, vibrant living spaces, and at the same time, it demonstrated a great environmental awareness of the dangers of continuing to allow cars to travel unimpeded, and it suggested ways in which that threat might be obviated. It very much focused it on allowing or suggesting that highways should be built to permit free traffic flow in most cities, but there was also an emphasis in some parts of the city, traffic should be restricted in order to allow the development of what Buchanan called oases of civilized living. And Buchanan recognized that not everybody was going to be able to move around towns and cities in cars, and so he was a great advocate of the maintenance, indeed the extensions on buses as a supplement to cars. He also recognized that it was absolutely essential to do something that was not the practice in the UK at the time. If you want to make towns compatible with automobile use, you have to integrate land use and transport planning. And when the report was published, it was very largely received positively, both by politicians at the local and national level, and just as importantly, more widely by the public. And a set of proposals were adopted on back of the report. National government, the Ministry of Transport and the Treasury, the UK Finance Ministry, made money available to local authorities to build urban highways. And local authorities, in their turn, were going to be allowed permission to build these highways as long as they justified them in terms of the new land use and transportation studies, which the Buchanan report had recommended. So that's the road side of things. On the railway side of things, well, the railways had been the dominant form of inland transport and were very important in many towns and cities in the 1950s. But by 1960, they were making huge financial losses. And a lot of political rhetoric around about 1960 was really about how the railways could be cut down to size in order to reduce the overwhelming losses they were making year by year. And this kind of policy was couched in the language of modernization. This was not seen as something negative. It was presented to the public as a way of making the railways modern, fit for purpose in the early in the middle of the 20th century. What did that mean in practice? Well, it meant that railway lines that were making a loss were going to be closed unless an overwhelming case could be made for their wider socio-economic value. And the lines in black on the map to the right are those which were going to be closed. As you can see, quite a significant proportion of the UK rail network as it was at the time. There was very, very strong national government oversight of this policy. Effectively, the decisions were going to be made by national politicians. And as a concomitant of that, very limited engagement with local government and local citizens and pressure groups and so on. The size, the scale of the railways' financial losses was seen as so large and so serious, the national government took upon itself powers to almost, but not quietly, exclude local groups and local citizens from the decision-making process. So let's look at the South East Dorset conurbation in a period, a couple of years, 1963 to 65, when the Beeching report proposed the closure of not all, but most of the railway lines in the area. There to the top left, you can see the railway network as it was in 1963, serving that modern 21st century travel to work area quite well. And at the bottom, you can see that the lines north of Bournemouth, the main town in the area, were proposed for closure. Now, back in the 1960s, most of those railways to the north of Bournemouth were not what we would understand as urban or suburban railways. They ran through the countryside and through rural towns and villages, were very much local railways. But, and it's a very big but, at just the time the Beeching report was being proposed, another government department, a national government department, Ministry of Housing and Local Government, was proposing in this study, the Southeast study, which wasn't actually published until 1964, but was well under development in 1963. It was proposing that perhaps there should be a new city or a new conurbation developed in the southeast corner of Bournemouth, of Dorset, in and around Poole, Bournemouth and Christchurch, in order to accommodate what was called overspill, in other words, excess population from London and the southeast. But this was not a fully developed plan. There were all sorts, well, first of all, there was no decision that this would definitely happen. And there were all sorts of questions about how large the conurbation might become, if indeed it went ahead at all, the sort of timescale that would be appropriate to its development, which parts of that southeast Dorset would be used for housing, for industry, for leisure use, and so on. And therefore, as a consequence, huge question marks over the kind of traffic flows that might develop if the conurbation went ahead. It was also a huge question whether there would be any role at all for railways, trains, in order to service the possibility of this conurbation in the southeast corner of the county. I think generally it's fair to say that the assumption was that automobiles, cars, and some buses would probably be the main way of getting around. Nevertheless, that was not a foregone conclusion. And what I want to do now is to look at some of the ideas that were generated by local citizens, local councils, local authorities, and other groups like representatives of business and commerce, citizens groups like Women's Institute, political parties and so on, when the proposal to close these railways north of Bournemouth were made public in the summer of 1963. And again, I want to look at the way in which the word modernization was used, because it's what I call, sometimes called a portmanteau term. It can be, on the surface, we all know what modernization means, but when you start to unpick the different uses that different groups make, it soon becomes apparent that different groups can mean very, very different things by the word. Now, the picture that you can see at the moment gives you a sense of what these railways north of Bournemouth were like in 1963. They were very old-fashioned, steam trains, irregular timetables, really not very attractive. But one of the arguments that was made very strongly by local citizens and local groups was it would be possible to modernize these railways, not necessarily to the point that they would stop losing money, but to the point where they might become useful for moving people around the area, and particularly if this conurbation was developed as suggested by the Southeast study. And so lots of different groups, I don't have the time to go into all of them, but for example, the splendidly named Branch Line Reinvigoration Society, which was an alliance between national lay experts and local people, looked at the economics of the line as it's currently operated and made all sorts of quite sensible suggestions about how the railway might be modernized in order to cut the losses, not to the point where the lines would make a profit, but to the point where the railways that the loss would be justifiable in terms of the wider social and economic benefits that might accrue. For example, it was argued that trains were a lot more accessible for disadvantaged groups like the young and the elderly, women and so on, than buses would be. It was argued, for example, that when you added in the cost of road accidents, if you allowed more cars on the road, that the losses on the railways would become more acceptable. And it was also argued very strongly that urban congestion in the area was already excessive and could only get worse even if more highways were built. And these kind of arguments, which were made, as I said, by many groups, were taken on board by the local authority, Dorset County Council, the main local government in the area, who described the proposal to close these railway lines north of Dorset, as you can see, utter folly in the context of the possibility of this new conurbation in the southeast of the county. So what actually happened? Well, as I said in my introduction to the Beeching report, national government had taken the powers to make all the decisions, and it indeed did make the decision to close the railways that Beeching had proposed. It did note, the national government did note that there were proposals for large growth in population, but argued that these people would not be people commuting to and from London by train, and so it was unlikely that the development of proposed new conurbation in southeast Dorset would be seriously prejudiced by closing the railways. I think part of the reason why that decision went ahead was that local authorities, the local governments, didn't work particularly well with each other in opposing the proposal to close the railways. In fact, to some degree, they fought against each other because they were the highway authorities, they were the part of government responsible for providing new roads. Governance was divided in the area, and Dorset County Council had one set of ideas, another local authority, Hampshire County Council, had another set of ideas, and they fought over how best to get money from national government to build these highways. So the fragmentation of local government in the area really did not help. I also want to mention that there was a lot of local support in the area for the idea of building more highways, and most people thought the railways were obsolete, they were old-fashioned, and there was no hope for them really, however much money you spent on modernisation. Once the railways closed in 1964 and 1966, really public protests, such as it was, died away very quickly, And it's quite interesting, just extremely quickly, to look at what happened in the following 10 years or so. I mentioned just a few moments ago that local government in the area was fragmented, this big divide between Dorset County Council and Hampshire County Council. But once the railways had gone, and it became clear that the only prospect was to build more roads, the two councils started working very closely together, and they jointly sponsored one of these new integrated land use and transportation studies, which national government required in order to for local authorities to gain funding for new highways. They produced that study quite quickly in a couple of years. It was published in 1967, and on the back of that, local government released really quite large sums of money so that the local authorities could build highways to deal with the expansion of the area. And those roads are the ones which are very largely there today, and which have tended, in physical terms anyway, to have locked the southeast Dorset conurbation into automobility. It's fair to say that the transportation study did recognise that there would be need for some traffic management, parking restrictions, and also it would be desirable to develop the bus network, and to a degree that took place. But unfortunately, any serious thought about environmental capacity and creating these oases of civilized living within the conurbation disappeared. And it's arguable it's only now in the early 21st century that serious thought is being given once again to how that might be created within the area. So what lessons can we learn from this case study? Well, I think it's really interesting to look at the parallels between the way the term modernization was used by different groups to mean different things in the early 1960s, and to compare that and contrast that with the way in which the term sustainability is used by today's local politicians, policymakers, and citizens and advocacy groups. It's really important, I feel, to look closely at who has the power to define how the term sustainability is understood and how that is turns into policy. Follow the money. You know, who has the money to decide which definition of sustainable urban travel will be turned into physical reality. It's also important to look at alternative accounts of both modernization and sustainability, and the kind of visions, the kind of imaginary futures that underpinned those uses of the two terms, both in the past and in the future. I think it's pretty clear from the case study that popular opinion, both in the area and national, had a big effect on the way that local politicians and national politicians thought about the likely reception of both the policy papers and also the practical policies that came out of that would be received by citizens, at the end of the day by voters. It's clear that alliances between citizens groups were important for the limited success that was to be had in the 1960s in opposing rail closures. And that is a lesson that's been learned today. I'm a member of an organisation called DCAN, Dorset Climate Action Network, which is making great strides in bringing together all sorts of disparate groups interested in the broad challenges of climate change in order to bring pressure to bear on the local authorities in order to make them much more radical in their thinking, not just about sustainable transport, but how the area might meet the challenges of climate change more widely. I think it's clear thinking about timescales is important. Back in the 60s, the politicians, particularly the national politicians, were interested about short-term objectives, particularly cutting the railways' losses, whereas the citizens and citizen groups were thinking longer term, 10, 15, 20 years or more, you know, arguing that railways would have or could have a future in a city that was not yet built, but which might well come in decades to come. History, I think, I hope I've convinced you, or at least suggested to you, can be sustenance for the long haul, because it's pretty clear to me now, and to some people in the area in the early 21st century, that the kind of ideas, the kind of visions underpinned citizens groups and pressure groups in the early 1960s about the possibility of using rail as what we now call a more sustainable form of urban travel, those groups were proved right, even though at the time there was no realistic prospect of them winning the battle and making sure that those railways stayed open. Okay, where do we, particularly you, go next? Just a few comments which I think will echo what I believe Louisa has already suggested for your project. It's really important, I feel, both from my experience and those of others I've worked with, that if we are going to develop popular stories about the past to inspire people to think more imaginatively about the future, then when it comes to developing the usable past, we have to co-produce that knowledge. In other words, we need to work together, whether we are specialist historians, activists, citizens, politicians, policymakers, in developing an understanding of the past that addresses our joint interests and concerns. And that, I think, will help us to then go on to develop stories which will really engage with people who, at the end of the day, and for perfectly understandable reasons, are not particularly interested in transport or travel per se, but would like to think that there is a possibility of Lisbon or wherever it is that we live being a more civilized place to move around in the future. I think there are a number of points to bear in mind when we undertake this co-production. The list I'm going to race through here is certainly not intended to be comprehensive. But I do think that we should start off just by doing an audit, really, of what we already know about the past as citizens, as policymakers, historians, or whoever we are, and also to ask those people who already are experts, either because they have studied the past in some depth, or either as academic historians or as lay experts. It's important to do an audit and see what we can say about the past without doing a lot of extra research. There's no point inventing the wheel. And we should cast our net quite widely. So don't just talk to people who say, or indeed are experts about transport and mobility history, but ask other groups who might not be particularly interested in transport, what their thinking is, what their understanding is about the past, because they might have insights which the so-called experts don't yet realize or know about. Having done that audit, all these different groups, the lay experts, the academic experts, the politicians, the policymakers, the citizens, the advocacy groups, need to get together and agree on a research agenda of the kind of research, the kind of study that needs to be done to fill the gaps in our knowledge of the past from this perspective of telling engaging stories about the future. And I think it's really important, and I say this with some passion, because I think it's something that we have, to a degree, failed to do so far in the UK, is to establish what I call product champions, who will commit themselves to this project of developing historical stories which engage and inspire people about the future, in all the sorts of organizations, the advocacy groups, the industry groups, the transport operators, local government, policy institutes, and so on, who will commit themselves to adopting this kind of thoroughgoing historical approach to understanding of the past with a view to inspiring people about the future. And finally, I know that Louisa has already mentioned this, but I just wanted to mention again that the case study that I have just outlined very, very briefly has been used in the UK context to do at least some of the work of the usable past that I've been outlining. And in particular, I've worked over a number of years now with the UK's national civil service in these history and policy workshops, where colleagues and I have used the material that I have outlined in order to encourage civil servants in the Ministry or the Department for Transport and other important organisations in national government to think more critically about the degree to which current policy making provides the kind of flexibility to deal with the changes that will inevitably happen over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the ways that we move around our towns and our cities. But maybe that is a good point for me to finish, because I've just about run out of time, and open up the floor to discussion about how we might move forward in the future, and let's see where we go. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Colin, for this inspiring talk. Then we open the mic to questions. Please go ahead. Podem perguntar em português, em inglês. Eu tenho várias também, mas fica mal. Essa só.
Said that we cannot see the room and that we cannot be here with us. I would just have a very brief and informative question. You mentioned in a specific source.
Yeah, I can't hear at the moment.
Okay. You mentioned in a specific source that that you assumed that it was the source. It seems like your interpretation out of the source itself that it was for automobiles that they were planning. What wasn't it in the sources? Because I find a lot in the sources of this planning of this suburban development.
I'm sorry, Louisa, I can hardly hear what you're
Better
saying.
here, I think so.
Like, yeah. It's very muffled.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Do you listen better now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
You can hear. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't have my notes here, but you mentioned a specific. I just want to know about the sources, because you said that it was kind of an interpretation that you were making, that you were assuming that it was for cars, but I wonder if that's not actually written in the sources. So if you don't need to over-interpret.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is just an informative question, because I find the sources I'm finding are really very specific about automobile use.
Yeah.
The frame that.
Okay. I think there are several levels to that question. When I talk about the assumption that automobility was the way forward, I'm talking both about the national context and the local. At the national level, the Buchanan report, Traffic in Towns, was really a report that was commissioned to, was intended to, and delivered a set of proposals to restructure UK's towns and cities in order to accommodate the growth of motor traffic. We're not only talking about cars, but also motorcycles and scooters, and also, of course, we keep forgetting about goods, about freight, about merchandise. There was an assumption that lorries and vans would become the dominant way in which goods were brought into and distributed around towns and cities. So there, I think there's no question really that the official narrative, the official story at the national level was an assumption that automobility was the way forward. It was clear, and this was one of the major innovations of the Buchanan report. It was clear that automobility could not be allowed to grow in an unconstrained fashion. So that the city was divided up into different areas, different regions, some of which were areas where automobility would be allowed to develop more or less untrammeled, but then these oases of civilization, civilized living areas where motor traffic, including lorries and vans, as well as cars and motorcycles, would be very, very greatly constrained. And generally, if you look at newspapers, for example, from that period, national newspapers, there was a very high level of public support, at least as expressed by, letters to the editor, for example, for that kind of policy, that kind of vision. That spilled over into local narratives. So again, if you look at local newspapers, which I did when I was carrying out the case study, and read editorials in those local newspapers, letters to the editor, so on and so forth, you do find a very high level of support for the assumption that automobility was the way forward in the urban setting. There's no doubt about that. It was the dominant narrative. But, and it's a very important but, those same sources, the likes of local newspapers, do show that there was a considerable minority of citizens who were opposed to that narrative. And now some of them, were just conservative with a small c, and they didn't like change. They didn't like the way that towns and cities were developing. But quite a lot of these people were very clear that they argued that the disadvantages of urban automobility outweighed the advantages. So these were the kinds of people who argued that pollution would increase, that more people would be killed and injured on the roads, that children would be excluded from playing on the street, for example, so that the streets would become even more thoroughfares for motor traffic and less places for meeting other people and playing in, and so on and so forth. And these were the kinds of citizens, some of whom went on to develop reasoned arguments against the closure of the local railways, because they saw the local railways as potentially a way of not replacing all automobiles, that nobody went that far, but certainly reducing the degree to which automobile traffic would be allowed to develop in the area. So those, I don't know if that answers your question, Louisa. I mean, I have looked at sources outside of the official documentation as a way of trying to get an understanding of the diversity of attitudes towards urban travel in this period. I've also done a little bit of oral history, because we're still within the scope of lifetime memory. We're going back about 60 years now, so it's not too late to do oral history for this particular period. And again, you get this mixture of views, a mixture of attitudes towards automobility.
Thank you, Colin. Another words, another comment, some question. I have one, but I'm gonna wait for some other one. Patricia, you have to come here. Sorry.
Can you hear me, Colin?
No.
Can you hear me now, Colin?
I can, yeah, that's great. Yeah.
It's as I was listening to your talk, and I did do a master's in the UK, and so I am quite familiar with the Beeching report. But actually, what I wanted to say now, I mean, as I was listening to you, I was thinking about this again. In Portugal, we actually had an echo of what happened in the UK as well, in using exactly the same terminology, which for me was something interesting to hear you say, because I wasn't aware of that. But the use of the term modernization was exactly the name of the railway plan we had in the late 1980s. Mm. And again, the use of the term modernization was exactly in the same terms as you reported in your talk, which it's a nice parallel from which we can learn as well. But what I wanted to say is that, so in Portugal, I think since then, we have lost about a third of our railway network. I think in the UK it was more, about half of it, I think, maybe not that much. But also what has happened over the last, I guess, 10 years, perhaps even a bit more, is that some of these closed railway lines have been turned into cycle lanes. So with a very specific use for leisure. But also more recently, we had the presentation of a new and perhaps the first proper national railway plan. And some of these old closed railway lines that have been turned into cycling lanes, dedicated cycling lanes, might now be again turned into railways. Only a few cases. And of course, with a lot of uncertainty around it. But the question I wanted to ask was whether you are aware of similar occurrences in the UK.
Yes.
Those lines, particularly in Devon, but can be other places. I think in Scotland there were.
Yeah, very much so. You're right. We did lose rather more than a third of the national network as it was in the 1960s. Perhaps not quite as much as half, but we're down to about 11,000 route miles now. One of the real losses, I think, of railway policy in the 1960s was the failure to protect the track bed of closed railways. I mean, we don't have time to go into the reasons why that happened, but as a generalization, when a railway was closed, British Railways, the nationalised authority responsible for them, ripped up the track, demolished a lot of the infrastructure, the bridges and so on, to save money, and wherever possible sold off the land, both to generate income for modernisation of the remaining network, and also to remove any liability that they would have had as landowners. So a lot of these routes were lost. You know, that's another example of the loss of flexibility. There was very little possibility of reopening these lines. However, that did not happen everywhere. And there has been, particularly in the last 25 or more years, actually, 30 years or so, quite a lot of fragments of railways have been reopened as the kind of greenways that you're talking about, as shared cycle routes and pedestrian routes. On the whole, that tends to be in rural areas because there was less pressure or less incentive or the market to sell off the land was not as great in rural areas. So that tended to be accidentally, as it were, where the integrity of the route was provided. So it's easier to reopen those railways as greenways. There are limited examples in towns where it's happened as well. I also recognise the phenomenon that you described about a very limited possibility of reopening some of these closed lines. That has been happening in the UK over the last, well, actually, ever since the Beeching report, but more in the last 20 or 30 years. It's very expensive. It's particularly expensive when infrastructure has been destroyed, but it is happening. And again, there are one or two places where railways that have been repurposed as greenways, as cycleways and so on, where there is now discussion about reopening them as railways. And then, of course, you get this very interesting conflict, or at least the potential conflict, between campaigners and politicians who want to reopen the railway and those people who argue that the greenway, the established, often long-established greenway, is a better way of using that land. So, because there's no right or wrong answer to that debate, every case has to be taken on its own merits. But I do recognise the situation that you've outlined in Portugal. Really interesting to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, we tend to follow your transport model quite a lot. Thank you.
Hi, Colin. Can you hear me? Yes.
I can. Yes.
Yes. Yes, I actually remember because I was in the same place as Patricia, and I did meet Colin Buchanan. He was very old.
Wow,
and,
gosh,
yes, and
that's, that's impressive.
You can
I'm
see my
impressed.
white beard.
Well,
He was
I'm
very
the
old,
same.
and like a lot of old men,
Yeah.
he was writing a book that was saying, "I have told you so."
Yeah, well, right.
That's
Yeah.
what old men do. But anyway, but anyway, his point, what he told me, is that the politicians ignored all these environmental zones and just took over all these roads, because there is another word apart from modernization, which is modernism, which is also with the complicity of architects like Barbican, so stuff like that. So my question is, at what point that politicians also cherry pick this kind of technical reports? Because, for example, the environmental zones can be the grandparents of low traffic neighborhoods or super blocks in a way. So that's something that was not done, in fact. And the other thing that I was listening to you is to what extent that the past stifles our imagination for the future. And I think it's very important what you said, that indeed learning about the mistakes of the past is very important. But also, I think it's also important to get us a little bit free from the past.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. Let me deal briefly with your point about the Buchanan report. I think it's, even though there was a good deal of enthusiasm from national politicians and indeed more widely for the Buchanan report, including its suggestions for restraining traffic in certain parts of the city to provide these so-called environmental areas, I think that the undermining of the report in practical terms started pretty well straight away. It's as simple as that. There was such enthusiasm amongst politicians and the public for automobility that the easy bit of the Buchanan report was to adopt the proposals to predict future levels of transport in urban areas and provide the highways that would allow the traffic to flow as freely as possible on them. It was much harder to gain the sort of finance that was necessary to develop the environmental areas, much harder to generate, in practical terms, the enthusiasm for the restraints on automobility that which were central to the proposal to develop environmental areas. So, as I very quickly suggested in that slide I had on what happened in southeast Dorset after the railways had closed, it's very clear that the local authorities cherry-picked Buchanan's way of thinking in the land use and transportation study, and basically said, well, there's money to be had for national government for highways, and there isn't money from national government to do anything else, so we'll take the money to build the highways. And that's exactly what they did. Any serious thought about environmental areas just seemed to disappear. But I agree absolutely that those environmental areas can be seen as the forerunner of today's low traffic zones. So it is possible to recover radical ways of thinking from the past and to put them into action in the early 21st century. Do we need to escape from the past? Yes, of course. I mean, really, I suppose the central thrust of what I've been saying this afternoon is that in the past, one narrative dominated. It's easy to understand in the context of the time why that narrative became dominant. The narrative, the way of thinking about the future, the way about thinking of towns and cities as ones in which traffic flows were largely in automobiles, came to dominate. That was turned into practical policy and practical proposals with the money to make it happen. And that is what has locked us in physical terms in that part of the country and in so many other parts of the UK and indeed more widely into urban automobility. And it has locked us in, or many of us, into ways of thinking that assume that no other ways of moving around towns and cities are possible. Now, that has started to change in the last 10, 20 years or so. But yes, we have to escape from the past, not only in terms of the physical infrastructure, but also in terms of the dominant ways of thinking about the future. You know, what I'm suggesting is we go back to the past, we look at the subaltern narratives, the narratives that were lost and have been lost to the popular memory in many instances, and recover those and reintroduce them into the discussions and the stories that we tell today, to say, look, you might think that, you know, having cycle lanes everywhere and the 15-minute city and getting people to walk and cycle a lot more is absolutely bonkers, but it isn't absolutely bonkers, because people were thinking about it half a century ago and they lost those debates, they lost those battles, but you know, what they were saying was sensible, and we can start to recover some of the visions from half a century ago, not in every detail, but at least in terms of its thrust, and to imagine cities and towns in a radically different way from today's reality. So yes, go back to the past, partly in order to escape the common sense, in inverted commas, which is the way that most people think about the present and future of urban transport, because to some degree, subconsciously or semi-consciously, their way of thinking about the present and future has been shaped by the dominant narratives from the past.
Thank you so much, Colin. We have to come to an end. As I say before, so happy to have you here, and inspiring talk on usable past, really, and in this sense that we have to think about what these dominant narratives and this wasteful past that has pervade or shape our minds for decades. Thank you so much, Colin. See you very soon, and we'll be in touch for this project.
Well, thanks for listening, everybody, and thank you for the questions and comments. Really interesting. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
E convidávamos a nossa assessoria. E já agora só justificar que é muito importante que toda a gente, porque é que o Colin não teve cá. Igual o Colin por norma, mas acho que vale a pena justificar, porque o Colin não anda de avião. Ele não anda de avião, ele anda de comboio, como a gente poderia estar à espera, ou de barco, e há um ferry que vem de Inglaterra, ao norte de Espanha, mas que não funciona no inverno. Só funciona na primavera. E ele, então, não tendo esse ferry, conseguiria vir de comboio, mas não temos, porque ainda equacionou essa hipótese, mas depois já não conseguia vir devido aos compromissos que tinha. E vale falar, mas eu acho que é engraçado, não é? Um bocadinho também da lógica das alternativas. Mas pronto, agora se calhar íamos então ver. E obrigado. Depois temos cá às 10 para as 6, mas eu depois